Order, and welcome to the second session of the Select Committee's inquiry into innovation, growth and the regions. And this morning, we will be examining a question which has bedeviled growth generally and regionally for decades, or actually you could say for centuries now, and that is access to finance and infrastructure. And we're very pleased to be joined for the first panel by Irene Graham, the Chief Executive of ScaleUp Institute, and Duncan Johnson joining us remotely, who is the Chief Executive of Northen Gritstone. And so I'll start with a question to each of you and then pass on to members of the panel. But could you, I'll start with you, Irene Graham. Could you tell me what you see as the main barriers to accessing finance for startups and scale-ups in the science and technology sector?
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm delighted to be here today. And the ScaleUp Institute, by virtue of its name, is very focused on our scale-up economy, which is around 34,000 of our SME community today that generate over 55% of that SME economy, 1.4 trillion. So very important that we get this right in terms of their needs. Access to growth capital, which I'll come on to, is one of the key challenges, but we shouldn't forget that access to markets, access to talent and access to space to grow is also very critical. And in looking at access to growth capital and investment, we should not forget that procurement is part of that as well, and something that I think the committee should look at in future reviews. In terms of our work, we've looked at sizing the overall growth capital gap for our scale-up economy across the country, and in 2020 we estimated that to be £15 billion per year, both with the alignment of the COVID dynamic adding another £7.5 billion to that long-term sort of growth capital gap. Some of the critical aspects for us is, do we have the scale of funds that we need? Are they coming in early enough to our scale-up economy as those life sciences and deep tech businesses grow and scale? How do we have the right institutional funds coming in? Over the last decades, our institutional funds, which used to invest around 50% in equity, is now reduced to 4%. So challenges in terms of accessing capital are actually, do the investors know the sector and are they connected to the sector? If you're further away from London and the South East, your ability to access the capital goes up. Around 7 in 10 of our scale-ups today do not feel they've got the right amount of capital to fuel their growth. And many of them, 6 in 10, believe that money is staying in the South East. So how do we actually build the regional capability, connect the funding into our localities and connect it into the life science and tech community? Now, we have been very successful in raising funds from overseas. When you look at our industrial sector strategy overall, the majority of money coming in from Series B onwards is coming from international players. So how do we get our UK community and funding available towards those UK businesses is really critical, and being able to access that from a UK perspective. Very good initiatives are taking place. The British Business Bank, the permanency of that, absolutely critical. The British Growth Partnership, how that will crowd in institutional funds alongside what the Mansion House reforms, and how we build that at scale, the regional funds that the British Business Bank has and how we develop those further, and the work they do indeed around the country with a variety of our different private sector players. Innovate UK, a very critical function in terms of the early stage risk capital for our life sciences community, and the LIFT initiative obviously has been born out of the Life Sciences Scale-Up Review, which is an important initiative that we must see continue, similar to the Breakthrough Fund. So there's lots of different varieties of now planks of opportunity to unlock the investment. We've got to see that translate into the businesses and connect into the localities across the country.
Thank you, Irene Graham. As part of your response, you posed a lot of questions. How do we get access to capital? How do we ensure that the capital that is there is focused on scale-ups? How do we get the Business Bank to be more successful? Forgive me, but we've been asking these questions for decades, as I said, and I think you've been at the ScaleUp Institute for 9 years now, is it not? Should we not be seeing some answers to those questions, and just in particular? So could you sort of say what is different now that you expect to ensure change in terms of government policy or in terms of the geopolitical situation? And could you say we talked a bit about pension funds and access to capital. Now, and the government is specifically looking at consolidating defined contribution funds. How can the government ensure that more of that capital goes to investment in our innovation economy, and particularly across the country?
So I think, just to be clear, I think there has been a lot of movement forward in terms of the initiatives that are in play by the current government. I think the importance of giving the British Business Bank permanency to invest across the cycle of growth is absolutely vital. The importance of the British Growth Partnership, a new vehicle that is going to be established that will be able to crowd in institutional money, is absolutely critical in building that scale of capital needed across the country and across our sectors. These are very important game-changing initiatives alongside the Mansion House reforms and compact that is seeking to unlock that institutional funding. So the vehicles that we currently have in the British Business Bank and Innovate UK are going to be really important, and how they partner with our private sector players as we seek to make sure the right capital reaches into the local environment. And I think that's a really critical stage and critical steps forward.
How will we know it's been a success?
I think you'll know it's when you start to see, and as we are beginning to see, some of the players like Phoenix, like Schroders collaborating with the British Business Bank to develop funds, and with each other to develop funds. We will start to see it as we see more investment coming in from UK players into our scale-up economy and tracking that overall. We'll start to see it in what's already happening with Northern Gritstone, but is emerging in the southwest and Scotland. Some of the innovation funds that are being established with local pension funds, collaborating with the university. So you'll start to see new funds emerging. Then we should also see how that actually comes in to the marketplace overall and backs the businesses that are growing overall. So these are really important planks for the future, and ones that we must double down on and deliver to. And I think they're very important initiatives. Alongside what's happening in capital markets, there's a huge amount changing in capital markets, the listings reform, new vehicles coming online in terms of what the stock exchange and others are working on in Pisces, again, to try and open up the private sector capital to businesses across the country.
Thank you, Irene. And you mentioned Northern Gritstone, so let me now turn to Duncan Johnson, Chief Executive Officer of Northern Gritstone. Let me ask you the same question with regard to the barriers to access finance for startup and scale-ups, and what role, particularly in the science and technology sector, and what role government should play in addressing these barriers. But can I ask you also to think about how the finance that is available, and the UK has the second biggest finance markets in the world, how that is better directed to science and technology startups and scale-ups. So the economist Mariana Mazzucato has argued that too much of capital markets funding is going, if you like, to the financial instruments and tracker, etc., rather than to the productive economy. And how can we see that change?
Chi, thank you very much. I mean, that's an enormous question, and I will sort of go at picking some of that apart. I mean, I expect the reality is money likes going to where it's made money before, and the early stage venture sector in the UK has not produced as good a returns as other areas. So if you are a private market allocator of money, you will go to where you have made better returns. And I remember having a a dinner once with Dave Willits about 10 years ago, who berated me for investing in non-life science and deep tech businesses. I said, well, the reality is I can't raise money for those other areas because we don't have the track record that you have in private equity or private credit. So I think we have a situation where other areas have attracted the capital because they produce better returns. And I think the profit element of this we can't ignore. If we want to crowd in private capital, it has to produce commensurate returns for the risk it's taking. I think that's really important. And at Northern Gritstone, we are a manifestation that people are willing to take on that risk. And I think we went around it talking about profit with purpose. So it's not all about purpose. It is profit that has purpose, and the two are important. I think that was important in us raising the capital. 60% of our capital has come from pension funds, as I think was mentioned. And a large chunk of that has come from local authority pension funds who can see the impact we can have initially locally, but then regionally, and then UK-wide by what we do successfully. But it's really important that we produce great, what I would call great businesses that are capable of scaling and capable of being competitive on a world-class basis. And for that to happen, it's not just all about money. It's about some of the other things that Irene mentioned, which are talent and space and infrastructure and culture, that I think are just as important and are not quite there yet either. So I think capital is one element. I think there are other elements of this that matter as well. But we are making great progress. I mean, the very fact that Northern Gritstone exists is proper progress if we're looking for actual examples of the direction of travel.
Thank you, Duncan Johnson. And we will be coming to look at infrastructure and transport, etc., later on this morning. But for the moment, we are going to focus on access to capital. And I'm going to ask Adam to come in now.
Yes, thanks, Chair, and good morning, Duncan. Good morning, Irene. Nice to see you today. We hear a lot, and we've had a lot of discussions on this committee recently about the innovation valley of death, the bit in the middle technology readiness level where good ideas go to die. I'm intrigued as to your thoughts about whether you think the government's proof of concept fund goes far enough to support innovators through that valley of death, and then how we can use that fund to specifically support regional growth. Maybe we start with Irene.
It's a great question. I think when I look at the proof of concept fund, great, it's quite a small amount. The reality is I think you've got to look at the components of different pockets of government funding at the moment. I think the proof of concept is one. Then you've got Innovate UK and its grants and its innovation loans. Then you have what the British Business Bank is doing with regional angel programs and regional funds. What we've got to do is connect that capital up. This is not about multiple funds, but how do we make sure that the fund then is followed on. So if you've got a proof of concept fund and it does actually prove the concept and it works, how are we going to then connect that up into the next level of funding, which might be an innovation loan, or it might be into an angel funder that is backed by the BBB. So I think that is going to be absolutely critical, because the proof of concept fund, great, but it's a small amount for what we really have as the opportunities ahead of us. So I think you've got to get that connected up. And the other thing that we hear quite regularly from businesses that have had a proof of concept, whether it be through a grant project by Innovate UK or indeed this initiative, is there's then the opportunity to buy from that business. And are we doing that well enough from a public sector point of view, particularly if you look at the life sciences environment? So there's real opportunity there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Irene. Duncan, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point Irene makes about the scale of the proof of concept fund is absolutely spot on. 40 million across 5 years is £8 million a year. That is not a proper amount of money for this. If it was 40 million a year, I'd be saying it's not a proper amount of money. So I think the scale of it is in where we want it to be for the ambitions we have for turning one of the UK's global leading positions, which is research coming out of our research intensive universities. We are number one per capita in the world. So if we think putting 40 million over 5 years is the right amount against that, that to me doesn't match off quite right. So I think there's a scale issue. I think the other issue is around what I describe as getting businesses match fit, ready to start the journey. So one of the areas where we've had to invest in, and when I say have to, we want to invest in very early, is before businesses ever start the journey of leaning in with mentors, with our talent function, our growth function, and trying to help entrepreneurs and founders and the teams be ready for the race, because it is a race. And to be successful here and to get through the valley of death, you need momentum, you need commercial traction, and the earlier you can get that, the better. And if you can start the race fitter and better and prepared for that, you have more chance of being successful. And that's one of the areas where we're trying really hard to lean in on, is before stuff ever emerges from the universities, that bit of the journey.
Great. Thank you very much, Duncan. So kind of building on the points you've just made there, particularly about the sort of funding pipeline, how do you believe that government support should be structured so that we can kind of de-risk the private sector investment in long-term innovation?
And I think you've got, as a government, and we do have, and it's really important that we maintain and make consistent and permanent the agencies we have. I've mentioned the British Business Bank. Innovate UK plays a really critical role in this commercialisation. We do need to make sure that has the permanency and scale that it can bring, because to Duncan's point, it also has iCure that helps this commercialisation stage. It also has its growth and scale-up programme that is really leaning in very proactively to the businesses that have got the highest potential to go global and make a significant difference. So it is about how we, in one sense, account manage our most innovative businesses. The private sector has started to bring in high-growth teams and account management. You'll see it with a number of the banks, really segmenting and really being really laser-like, rather as Duncan says, in terms of the way in which they seek to support the business through all its different needs. And I think Scotland does that well in the UK. Wales is doing that well. Northern Ireland is doing that well. In England, we don't really have a proper, at a local level, account management structure that spots the businesses early and then helps them access that public resource effectively. I think that's something that can be done using existing resources, but better and pointed towards these businesses, including sort of a concierge service that France does on top of that. So there's practical ways that you can actually get to the business early and then hook them into the public and private resourcing.
Thanks, Irene. Duncan, did you want to add to
that? I think those points are all really well made. One of the things that surprised me most of setting up Northern Gritstone was the thin nature of the local ecosystem for helping businesses really accelerate through. And that's one of the things where we spend a fair bit of time at Gritstone of trying to crowd in that sort of quality ecosystem around the businesses in terms of accelerating that journey. And I think one of the reflections of this north-south lack of level playing field here has been how that ecosystem is very concentrated into London. Now, London is only 2 hours away from Leeds, Manchester and Sheffield, but sometimes it feels a lot further away than that. But actually having that as a local thing matters. Starting up businesses and scaling them up is what I describe as a contact sport, and it does need to be local. And when you go to the places that do this really well, and I call out Kendall Square, the committee members have been there, that's so inspirational when you go there and see this ecosystem working really, really well. And that's what we're trying to create around the Northern Triangle with Gritstone.
Thank you, Duncan. And that leads well, actually, into my next question. So you talked about London and the sort of London centricity. Very quick one-word answer from you both, if I could. 72.9% of companies backed by the British patient capital, for example, are London-based. Do you think that's good enough, yes or no?
Simply, no. We need to get more regional. And I think, to be fair to the British Business Bank, they are seeking to do much more regionally, and they want to expand their remit to do that. So I think we need to give them that opportunity to do that.
Thanks, Irene. Duncan, yes or no, good enough?
Well, it's clearly not, but you need to have a more nuanced answer than a yes, no there. But
well, I was then going to ask. Don't worry. Was how given that you both said no, and I admit I predicted you probably would both say no. How do you feel that we should be doing a better job of supporting businesses outside of London in that case?
I think it is really important to note to reflect that the British Business Bank, in the 10 years it's existed now, has a regional network, and I think that's really vital. And it's doing a lot of partnerships at a regional, local level, which we want to see expand. And I think that's really important. It's making a difference. When you look at the businesses that are being backed, it really does actually show their influence on the market, particularly with the European removal that's come of the EIF-EIB. So I think we need to make sure they're able to do that even more and more flexible in that regard, as coupled with the Innovate UK dynamics. And I've mentioned, and picking up Duncan's point, I mean, we know for a local growth, to drive local scale-up growth, there's three critical things that make a difference. Not the number of startups or the density, not the transport links, but actually access to skilled talent. So how are the universities aligning in towards your innovation companies? Access to clusters and hubs, and we're going to hear from Audley Park later, that infrastructure and place and space to grow, really vital, because it crowds in the mentors and the funders as well. And then that access to local growth capital. So we've got to give the British Business Bank that ability to continue to build that, and I think the British Growth Partnership must have distribution that goes regionally.
Thanks, Irene. And Duncan, your thoughts on supporting businesses outside London?
So I have a sort of, I think, a slightly nuanced view on that, in that one of the amazing things about capital is it's very good at finding the best places to invest. So actually it's remarkably fluid and moves around. It's always amazed me I've been investing now in private markets for 30 years, and it's always amazed me where capital gets to. And the fact that only 28% is making it out of London is telling you something also about the product. So the product needs to be stronger as well to attract that money. But also what we've started doing is actually dragging up London people, skill set into the region. So over 20% of Northern Gritstone's team now have relocated into the Northern Triangle from London. I think that's a really, really important change in that polarity. We also we have an arrangement with a Cambridge-based venture builder called Deep Tech Labs, so bringing that skill set into the Northern Triangle. We're just about to launch something with the Crick Institute, with KQ Labs, to bring that in. So I think it's a two-way process. We have to create great investment product, and that will draw the money in. And there's a definite flywheel effect in that. And I think we've got to help the money help us, sort of thing, I suppose.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, both. And then final question for me. I just want to focus again on the British Patient Capital Scheme. In your view, do you think it's suitable for the science and technology sector, or do we need some bespoke approach?
I think it's done a very effective job when you look also at the sort of raft of different products underneath it, including the Future Fund Breakthrough, the LIFTS initiative. I think what we'll see going forward is, as we have to have, under that overall umbrella, I keep referring to the British Business Bank, that nimble and agile ability to become more sector specific when we need to be. We've been agnostic previously, so how do they dial up more of those sector specific initiatives? How do we crowd in, as Duncan has said, the institutional investors, and the British Business Bank and British Patient Capital has a role to play with the British Growth Partnership on the translation of that large ticket institutional money coming further down the chain into the growth economy. And that's what we need to see. Our international investors are very proactive. They're calling up businesses around this country to invest in them, and we need to see that risk appetite. And I think the British Business Bank, British Patient Capital is a translator to bring that risk capital from the private sector in.
Thanks, Irene. Duncan?
Yeah, I mean, BPC is, as all of the sector, is on a journey. I think the new leadership change at the bank with Louis, Taylor and Stephen Welton is taking it to the next stage. It's building on what's been done previously. And I think the initiatives we are seeing and the changes, Irene commented on the permanence of the capital, I think is really important. BPC is an important player in the landscape, and it's on its own journey. And I think going to a sensible place. It will be interesting to see whether the fund it's looking to raise, it will be successful doing it. I think that's an important element to see in their strategy of whether they can do that.
Thank you both. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. And Steve, you want to come in?
Yeah, Chair, I just wanted to maybe challenge Duncan a little bit on his answer, penultimate answer, just in that section. I suppose, Duncan, there's certain things here. We know that in my region, for example, that's my specialist subject, 2.7% of all private equity and venture capital invested in the country goes to the Southwest region. The Southwest has Bristol, the university, and Airbus, and various other sort of big tech clusters. You've got Exeter with the Met Office and life sciences. You've got Plymouth with a good university as well, and maritime and defence. And there are a lot of startups sort of there. But I don't. Your point around if the quality of the product isn't good enough, the capital won't flow. But we know that the capital isn't flowing into the regions well enough anyway, despite the fact that there are good products there. And the flip side of that is that people who want to start up businesses or scale-up businesses feel like they can't access capital and so move to London and the Southwest. So I don't necessarily think it's good enough to say that, the capital will flow where the products are. In fact, what you have done is set up specifically in the North to encourage capital into the North to find the good products. So can you just expand on your answer a little bit more on that?
So unless I had good product, I wouldn't have raised the money. Okay, so I think it's very clear. So I had to set out why investing in Northern Gritstone would give people an acceptable market return. And there's lots of elements to that. That's a density of research. It is some level of track record. We actually did quite a few things to make it a more attractive offering to the pension funds. So there were some things in the structuring and what we were going to put into the portfolio, which I don't think is sensible to talk about here. But the density matters. So I could say that between Leeds, Manchester and Sheffield universities together, they were the number one producer of R&D in the UK. That's a really strong statement to say. I could show there was enough flow of opportunity set to raise something of the scale to do what we need to do. And that's one of the issues of thinking that you can replicate this everywhere. There needs to be a level of clustering and density to attract sufficient capital for something like Northern Gritstone to exist, because we do a lot. So we have an investment team, but we also have a whole level of venture building that goes on and that type of thing. And clustering is really very local. So Plymouth and Bristol are not a cluster. They are in the Southwest, yes, but if you go to the US, they'll tell you a cluster is an hour travel or 10 miles. So it's a very local thing for the contact sport to occur in. So yes, there's some interesting things going on in Bristol, and Set Squared have tried to do this, but there are also reasons why they're finding it a little bit harder. And I think scale is one, proving out flow and that type of thing do make it difficult.
Thank you. We will, I'm sure, come back to discussing the ability or the success of capital in finding the best products to invest in, because as we know, there are structural concerns with regard to the amount of capital that flows to women founders, for example, and which flows as well as the regional dimension. But I think what you're saying, Duncan Johnson, is that there needs to be work on shaping and signposting capital to where the good products and the good investment targets are, as well as improving the amount of capital which is available.
If I might add something just on the Southwest. Sorry, Duncan. I think Northern Gritstone, if you think about the North, you had the Northern Powerhouse sort of brand, you've had the Midlands Engine, there's a sort of branding there. And Northern Gritstone's been a real trailblazer. I think what's happening now in the South West Fund, which is British Business Bank led, a lot of us worked on making sure something like that got established there. I think that's a big marker. And then what you've got happening with Set Squared and Quantex and how that's also brokering into Wales and the local pension funds, I think there's a huge opportunity. So I think what we're seeing now is what's working elsewhere being replicated, because you have got terrific space and players in the Southwest. I think there's a real opportunity now to drive that forward.
I think if I just
Sorry.
close
Very,
off,
very
I think
briefly, we do need
less
to move on.
Southwest, but I think it's more about not London and the South East.
Yeah, and I think what you're seeing now is the university stepping up to collaborate more. I think you're seeing the funds that are coming in with the British Business Bank, and that creates the identity and that recognition of it's not just about startup, but the scale-up opportunity that's there.
Right, well, let's move on.
Can I just stand up for the South East? We're not all London. And we don't all have access to finance in the same way as London does, and the triangle is not a triangle, it's 3 spots.
Yep.
Isn't Milton Keynes getting the in the Oxford-Cambridge Arc, which is essentially
Well, we've had to make
lily?
the case. Make the case that we are actually important
Even
to the
more
art.
on top of everything.
And I think
you've got
that's a
already.
really valid point. I know the British Business Bank's regional funds, so, the outside of London South East, we do need actually probably a South East fund as well that regionally is deployed.
Wait, sorry, now, Lauren, let's take us on.
Brilliant. No, thank you. Thank you, Chi. So I've got a question here about kind of investor knowledge as a barrier to science. Coming from a science background myself and going on a weekend, this is how you can do spin out, this is how you can do business, and it just being absolutely mind-blowing. Many scientists, you get into to make discoveries. And you mentioned earlier about a concierge service, about connecting up your scientists with your businesses, because they're very different skill sets, and if they coalesce, that's amazing. Can you talk me through about this barrier of knowledge and being able to understand the science and its potential, as well as the investors that can then tap into it?
Yeah, that knowledge asymmetry. So I think firstly we have in our institutional investor base a gap of the knowledge of our sectoral industrial sector strategy sectors and growth economy. So I think, what do we do to make sure we're showcasing that around the country? Can we develop better creative invest in life sciences? There's some work looking at how do we build the right toolkits to enable our investors to fully understand what is around the country. That's one thing that could be done further.
Sorry, could you just be more specific? Who should do that?
Well, I think that's something we have seen progression with Innovate UK and the British Business Bank. I think that's an opportunity, working with industry, the life sciences sector, the creative sector, in how we actually build those toolkits overall. Then we have, in terms of sort of building the knowledge of the investors, something that has been piloted, which is working very well, is the Science and Venture Capital Fellowship that has just commenced with the Royal Academy of Engineering and Imperial College. This seeks to replicate some of what happens in the US under the Kaufman initiative. That is a really important initiative that needs to be expanded upon. It's just started, it's just launched. It's trying to build that investor capability into the science space and the life and the quantum dynamics. That's a real opportunity to take forward.
Is that like a list, like a speed dating list? Like, here are all our amazing investors that could have got interest in this space. Here are our scientists.
That's a simple, bringing the investors together into the actual clusters, into the place. That's really important. So how do we do that better in that connectivity? Then actually through online and education, how we raise the knowledge of the sector and the region. The Science and VC Fellowship is actually how we build our investors for tomorrow in terms of the future opportunities. And that's a much more structured way in which you seek to get the investor knowledge up on what the opportunity is, for example, in quantum as an example, and how we connect that in and raise the sort of understanding of our investor base, which is a really important initiative, which the US has undertaken that in a great deal of focus over a number of years. And then back to the other point, it's just that account management. If we use data to pinpoint, HMRC data, to pinpoint the businesses early, get them account managed by our local government resources and teams, and then connect the investor base in through the products and services, both in the public sector and the private sector, that will make a big difference. It is in Scotland and Northern Ireland and Denmark and elsewhere.
Okay. Duncan, do you want to add anything to that?
No, so the what we have an absolute surplus of is the science. So at one level, it's almost the commodity of our equation. So the bit that is I think is the key piece is the talent, and that's talent at many different parts. It's Irene mentioned the fellowship scheme. That's a really important scheme of training up more investors, but actually it's the talent to help grow a piece of science to create a world-class product that you can base a world-class and world-scale business around, and that is the bit that we work really hard on. But that is actually the bit that I think is most scarce, and it's helping entrepreneurial scientists found a business that has that potential and that ambition, and that's about creating a team around those people. And we have a whole function that does that, and it's a pretty important part of our business, and leaning in really early to understand about creating a high performing team, but also to take what is essentially a technology product led business into a customer led business as quickly as possible, because that is the thing that allows you to accelerate through the development of the business and raise the capital, etc., etc.
Is it just the team that? Just the team, but the incredible amount of expertise that is there to take that science to the next level with investors. Why do we see so many companies go overseas? Is it that long-term investment space? Is it regulation? What is it that we can do at this side to try and push the case for that investment staying in this country?
Is that a question to me?
Yeah, go for it, Duncan.
Okay, you have vastly bigger capital markets in the US with a lot more history of doing this, and it also has a vastly bigger market for selling your product to. So it's a pretty natural journey for most high-tech business, or in fact any business with that type of ambition, to try and have a US presence. It's a pretty natural part of the journey. So I don't think that's necessarily something we want to just rail against, saying that's a bad thing. Actually, to get a UK business to be a global leading business, it needs to have a presence outside the UK. That's pretty obvious. And the US has a lot of capital to back these businesses. So it also has a lot of people who've been there and done it. And that's talent that is important that we tap into. So, I mean, Gritstone has 31 investee companies at the moment, and we have US chief executives who've come in to run 3 of those. So one has relocated here, and 2 are doing it from the US, but for essentially still mainly UK-based businesses. So that is us trying to access that talent.
Can I just, Duncan Johnson, when you say the US has vastly larger capital markets, the city is one of the largest financial centres, the second largest financial centre in the world. Does the US have larger capital markets, or does it just tend to invest more in the productive economy?
But I mean, I don't actually know the stats on that. I mean, the US capital markets are vastly bigger than the UK's. It's a much bigger economy. It's the biggest economy in the world. So it also has a history of, through Silicon Valley and Kendall Square, it's more advanced on the venture route. So there's more capital there. So I do think that's right. I mean, the fact that the UK capital markets have gone backwards, whereas only now 4%, I think the number is invested in UK things, is something that is really unhelpful, and is something that I think the London Stock Exchange is doing a good job of trying to reverse that trend.
So I think when you look at whether it's US, Canada, Singapore, they're all investing in our scale-ups, and they're coming in early, as I said earlier. And that's because they've got scale, they're patient, they're putting more money in, they're following on, and they're very proactive. So it is really important that we get right what is currently happening in the Mansion House reforms and through the planned British Growth Partnership, in making sure that institutional money comes through and translates its risk appetite earlier than just at the scale-up phase, because that then allows you to follow on and take that company through the journey. I think that's a critical moment. I think we'll have the capital supply released, but how that translates through into players like Northern, Gritstone, Business Growth Fund and new vehicles will be very, very important. And that's where I think the roles of the British Business Bank and Innovate UK are going to be critical, and then how we join that up in a more effective way, which is why I keep coming back to this proactive account management and concierge and how we connect things through.
Thank you.
Great. Alison, I think you just wanted to come in briefly.
It will come under question 7 or 8. I can come in later.
Well, okay, sorry, Steve. You
Great, thank you. I just want to touch on some of the initiatives like the long-term investment for technology and the National Wealth Fund, and to what extent you both think those have improved access to finance for the Science and the Research Centre. Irene, do you want to go first?
I think it's been very positively received. I sat on the Life Sciences Scale-Up Task Force. I think this is a really important step that's been taken. We need to see, again, the ability for that to scale. But I think it really is bringing in and crowding in more private sector funds and at the scale that we need it to be. But we need to see that followed on with the British Growth Partnership and the other initiatives that we've spoken about, and given enough scale to invest in. The National Wealth Fund, I think, any other country that's sort of got a scale-up economy has got a wealth fund. Important how it invests into the infrastructure, how it collaborates with the British Business Bank as well, as we seek to that journey of a company and its growth through its growth cycle. I think as a country, instead of doing project-based activity, we do need to be more client and customer-centric in terms of how we follow through and connect the dots.
What does that mean in terms of how we need to change?
I think what we need to sort of think about more is, if a business is successful in gaining a grant and then has a proof of concept or a product that's working, how does that connect into the next stage of funding that it's going to need? And that means that connectivity, the Innovate UK and British Business Bank now have a memorandum of understanding to build that connectivity better. But it then also goes into how do we buy from those companies as well, and we need to see that becoming more effective overall.
Thank you. And Duncan, how do you think they're working?
We haven't really seen a huge amount of change from the LIFTS programme. That hasn't flowed into what we are doing. Now, we are mainly an investor at seed Series A, and we do some later stage investing into the portfolio. But we haven't really seen a change to those initiatives as yet. The National Wealth Fund, I think we need to see that come in and how that's actually going to play out.
Do you have a view on sort of the sounds and the sort of what it sounds like it's going to be doing, and do you think it's going to be doing the right thing, or do you want to see some change, or does it sound positive to you?
I mean, it hasn't really done much yet, so it's quite hard to know.
I think it's interesting it's been given a remit for the defence sector. I think it gives you flexibility. If we can be agile and flexible about where you direct certain of your strategic investment, that's going to be important.
Right, and then sort of the lifts and the tax credits seem to focus quite a lot on the life sciences sector. Are we over-indexing on life sciences? Are we sort of not quite doing enough for various other sectors in the
I think the industrial strategy is going to be a very important lever as to how we align across sectors. And I still think we have to be agile enough to look at the future emerging sectors that we won't even know about yet, which is why the Future Fund Breakthrough is important, because that's almost the newer element. So I think we've got to be agile, and and the industrial strategy should be a good opportunity to learn from what's happening in life sciences to take it across the other sectors. And then we have to be agile enough to spot where the opportunities are across the country.
Okay.
Yeah, I was quite surprised when I heard the stats on the R&D tax credits. I hadn't realised it was quite so biased into life sciences. I mean, one of the realities is life science investment absorbs a vast amount of more capital. It's very expensive to build great life science businesses, more expensive than deep tech in the main. So if you looked at it through that lens, actually, the fact that there's more R&D support going in to life sciences probably makes sense. But I agree with Irene. We don't know where the winners are necessarily going to be. We have this amazing world-beating science that's going on in the UK. I'm absolutely convinced that the UK's next mega company will come out from one of the things that Northern Gritstone or OSC or CIC are doing. but I don't know where that's actually going to be. And I think things like the R&D tax credits do play an important part in the early stage funding of these businesses.
Do you think they're flexible enough to sort of identify and support those sort of future sectors that we might not know about at the moment? Are they flexible enough for people to be able to access them?
You've got to convince people that you're doing R&D. So to the extent that you can do that, then they should be flexible enough, I would imagine. But this is not an area of particular expertise for me. I'm giving you quite a high level. The creative
sector has given suggestions for how it can be further moulded for the creative sector. So I think we've got to be open to those types of abilities to tweak. I think the other important taxation that we haven't talked about is EIS and SEIS. And one of the things on EIS, I think when you look at some of the life sciences and other businesses, that when they actually become scale and commercial, it's beyond the 7 years that EIS currently exists for. So I think that's an area where, should we have a growth EIS, how do we make sure we're not creating false cliff edges in relation to those, which I think is quite important for our growth economy and deep tech.
Now, we've only got about 5 minutes left for this panel and a number of questions, so we need to make progress.
Great.
And we have the absolutely critical issues of angel investors and venture capital.
Yeah, so just moving on to angel investors. Are there enough angel investors for science innovation outside of London?
I've mentioned a few times the regional angel programme, really important. I mean, Cambridge, one angel syndicate there, probably invests at the size of what is all of them in the Midlands and South West and Manchester. So we need to see that regional angel programme continuing to be developed. And grow that angel community and grow the lead angels that can invest in some of the emerging sectors. I think that's really important work, and make it flexible enough that perhaps not all the angel syndicates have to be FCA regulated to gain access to British Business Bank collaboration. So that's one area that we can come back on and give you some more briefing on.
Great, thank you. And then Duncan, just staying on angel investors and venture capital investment, which we touched on earlier on, outside of London. When we talked to Dame Angela, the chief scientific advisor, she says she has a joke with some Northern and other universities that the best thing you can do is invest in a few helicopters to get people out of London and up to the places that need investment and have great ideas and great products, as you call them. But what else? She admitted that was slightly facetious. But how given that we do want more capital investment outside of London and the South East to support what are good businesses and good ideas that are being generated, what more do you think we need to do? Is it about connecting those into the London network? We know, for example, that you're more likely to get international capital finance invested in the regions you are UK-based finance, for example. What can we do to sort of spread it around more equitably?
The game changer here is going to be poster children coming out from what we are doing. So show that we do have all the things we say we have, and actually we don't have enough poster children. I'm talking really about the deep tech space and the life science space in which Northern Gritstone operates in the Northern Triangle. There just isn't enough historic success to really get people to sit up and say, yeah, okay, I'm really missing out here. I've got to be part of it. And the moment you create that FOMO, you go to a different place. Now, I as you can probably tell, I am not a Northern person. I live in Hampshire, and I can travel around the whole of the UK each week. So I'm pretty sure to find these great opportunities, I'm pretty sure other people will do that as well. I'm not unique in doing that at all.
Do you think there's just marketing and a sort of a good sense of, is it vibes? Is a lot of it vibes?
Yeah, there's definitely a thing. Northern Gritstone, us coming into existence, has absolutely led to people saying, wow, they've raised nearly 400 million sterling of long-term investment capital for this from people who frankly should know better. So there must be something going on there that's really interesting. And we are running demo days where we're getting 400 people coming along to look at the product that we're creating with the universities in the north. And so it's starting to happen. Well, we've got to follow it up by making sure they are really successful businesses.
Right.
We just want to touch on the British Business Bank as a final note on that one. So the Enterprise Capital Fund, 60.6% is of that is invested in London and South East, for example. How can the bank better support regional capital?
So I think they have got their regional funds as well, and that's been expanding. We were very active in the South West Fund, and I think the South East is another area they want to come into. So I think we have to give them that opportunity to continue to expand and build those out, and with their regional network as well. So I think it's very important that that's what's being allowed to do.
Are they showing willing?
They definitely are very focused on that. I mean, that's one of their major planks of their objectives, and also how future funds connect into the regions as well. So I think that's incredibly important, and their regional network is important in that as well.
When should we expect to see change? Because the Startup Coalition found that 80% of VC funds are based in London and deploy 69% of their funds in London and the South East. And we have the British Business Bank, as Steve said. When do you think we should...
Well, I think if you look at our development banks, you've got Scottish National Investment Bank, you've got Welsh Development Bank, the British Business Bank works with them as well, and then you've got the emerging funds. I think you are seeing change already, and very happy to come back with some of our latest figures on that. I think you're already seeing change, and I think what we must do is continue to give the British Business Bank and our development banks across the different nations the support to be there for the long term, which is why the British Business Bank having a permanency to it is really important.
I suppose my challenge is that you seem to be looking at very incremental change, whereas I would argue we need to see some quite radical change, because we haven't seen a significant improvement for some time now.
The radical change comes when we unlock that institutional money. We need to see that shift from 4% into equity, much more closer to the 50% it once was. So we're on the cusp of radical change.
On the cusp of radical change.
And
Excellent.
what the British Business Bank has to make, it will be critical. And I think, just picking up Duncan's point, you shouldn't lose sight of what's happening with the Capital Markets Industry Task Force, what's happening with Pisces, what's happening with some of the initiatives the Stock Exchange has, like Flow, and its regional network to connect businesses in. Okay,
so let us. I'm going to bring in Alison, and then Martin, and then Emily to finish us quickly. We're going over a few minutes.
Very quick question, yes. Irene. I just want to jump back to the issue about angel investors, and I can't let questions on that go by without mentioning the fact that it's really hard to get angel investors to invest in female innovators and entrepreneurs. So as well as the regional inequalities, we have those inequalities, and with other diverse groups as well, which could really enhance productivity and growth in the country and within regions. What can be done to address that bias?
I think I'm part of the Invest in Women task force, which is raising a specific fund, 250 million, to invest in female founders. We've got the British Business Bank committing 50 million to invest in female-led funds. The Regional Angel Programme is expanding and we're seeing more angel groups develop who are women-led. The UK Business Angel Association is doing an awful lot in that regard. I sit on their board. Would be very happy to come and brief you separately on some of the developments there and what the opportunities are.
Thanks. Martin.
Thank you, Chair. Some very interesting comments come through this. I'm an engineer by training, and normally finance switches me off entirely. And I understood more of what we're talking about here than I did of protein folding, just a bit. You made some interesting comments, Mr. Johnson. You talked about plenty of science, but a lack of talent, by which I took it that you meant business people who understand the science and the innovation and the financing. Is the problem we're looking at here less of geography, but more of language? People invest in people. Financiers invest in people who can put up the financial arguments and explain the science as well. Irene Graham, you talked of concierges and account managers. Are we missing translation between finance speak and technology, engineering, science speak? And if that is the case, how do we build that? Do we teach our innovators to speak financier, or do we speak our financiers to speak innovation language, which clearly some of your people are already doing? You described some of that, Mr. Johnson, earlier. Okay. When I was in Silicon Valley, it was very clear that the engineers understood much more about finance than I hear from the scientists I speak to here. Mm-hmm. How do we fix that gap?
Great. Duncan Johnson, should we start with you, and then Irene Graham?
So talent is a team game. It's not just into individuals.
Could you speak into the microphone, Duncan? I can't hear you very well.
Okay, yeah, I've got a bad connection at the moment, I think. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes.
So the talent thing is a team game. So what we are looking to do is create teams around the science and around the opportunity set. There's just not that many people who've been there and done it, and that's where having people who've been there and done it is so helpful. And it what you find in Silicon Valley is you'll find people who are doing their fourth or fifth startup, and we just don't have that many people here who have that kind of experience to help sit alongside the engineers and the scientists. And that's the bit when I say we really want talent. That's the bit I really feel that if I could unlock lots more of that, I'd be brilliant. It'd be fantastic.
Thank you. Irene Graham?
I think when we look at our Skills England, we look at our talent, I think we have to embed this far more into the school curriculum, then into our university college curriculum as well. The States does that very well. And then there's what we build around that I've talked about, the Science and Venture Capital Fellowship, which there's a lot of that type of activity taking place in the US, and we need to really build that for the long term. And I think we talked about ICURE, but also some of the team aspects that Duncan talks about. There are some good initiatives, whether it's the private sector with their talent pools like BGF, Northen, Gritstone, that bring it into the business, but also things like Innovate UK are doing with their ScaleUp programme, is bringing that sort of team around the scientist, the founder, to help them into that next stage, whether it's commercialisation, branding expertise, or fundraising expertise. So I think there's opportunities around that to build that out.
Where would I go to find a list of Geordies who have been there and done it, for example?
We can give you that.
You could give
very
us
happy to. Yeah, we are splitting. We know all the scaling businesses, the scale-ups by every one of your constituencies, and also
I will certainly be asking
and
for that.
your women founders as well locally. We send them to all schools, so we can give you that information.
Excellent. Right, now we're running. I think everyone's very excited about that. We're running over, but we have a very important aspect to this, which is Emily is going to ask about now, and then we'll finish. Thank you for your patience.
Yes. I think it's quite a nice way to end this series of questioning. We've talked a lot about the regional dimension. We've talked a lot about how we match skills and finance and ideas. What role should local government play in that? And how, and thinking also about the mayors, particularly what should be their role in potentially, as I think Steve called it, marketing, but also kind of bragging about and creating those opportunities for connection in their area.
So the mayors have an absolutely vital role. And what's been achieved in London with the Grow London programme, we think every mayoral authority should have a scale-up plan in their local growth plans. They should have that addressing talent, addressing how they develop the clusters and hubs, and how they develop that local equity, leveraging the local pension funds and players like Duncan and others that exist elsewhere. It's so important. They have a real criticality around the brand, the positioning, and actually making sure that the ecosystem is leaning in. We've done a lot of work with local areas on how they build that ecosystem, and we want to see that continue. But local growth plans should have a scale-up plan.
And just to follow up on that, what role should local government leaders and mayors have in the priorities for the British Business Bank?
I think there is. I think the collaboration that's happening between the British Business Bank and local mayoral authorities and what was their priority is strong, and I think that still needs to dial up. But I think there is a strong connection there that can be built upon, and we've seen that in some of what's been rolled out as part of the British Business Bank's current regional framework. So I think that partnership is important. I think mayors also should learn from others, so expand programmes that work elsewhere across the country as well. And final point I would make is the space to grow. I think what's happening in Manchester with Alderley or what's been expanded on elsewhere is really important. How do you get that space that brings together the innovators, the mentors, the academics, and the funders? And I think that's what you see in our science parks in places like Alderley and what Bruntwood is doing and others are doing. I think that's really critical.
Duncan Johnson?
Yeah, so we're very fortunate to have Andy Burnham, Tracy Braben, and Oliver Coppard investing in Northern Gritstone through their Merrill funds. So they've actually invested in Northern Gritstone. We have good, close relationships, and that's a two-way dialogue in terms of things we can do to help in those local scale-up economies. And I think that's an important part of why Northern Gritstone has had the success it's had to date, is that connectivity to the locale and to local impact and how we can work together.
Thank you very much, and that is a very good note on which to end. And we're going forward to be talking about local infrastructure in our next panel. But for the moment, let me say a huge thank you to Irene Graham and Duncan Johnson. We found your contributions very insightful and are very grateful. Order.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Order, and welcome to the second panel in this morning's session, and a big welcome to our two panelists. And I will start off by following on from what we've been hearing earlier this session about the differences in access to finance between the regions and, say, the Golden Triangle. We've also heard concerns about infrastructure gaps, both nationally and regionally, affecting startups and scale-ups in science and technology. And we have immense infrastructure gaps, in particularly, for example, the investment per person in the Greater London Authority in public infrastructure funding was £34 per head, whereas in the North East Combined Authority it was £4.77 per head. Just to set the context. So can I ask our two panelists to briefly introduce themselves and to give the committee a sense of the key challenges when it comes to infrastructure and how you would propose that the government should address them. And I'll start with you, Dr. Kath Mackay.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm Kath Mackay, Chief Scientific Officer at Bruntwood SciTech, and our role is to create and operate innovation districts across the UK. So we're effectively in the infrastructure business. The majority of our investments and our sites are in Northern and Midlands regions, and we've also got sites in Cambridge and London, which I'm sure we'll talk to in this panel. We've got 9 campuses in those locations and 31 innovation hubs in those cities. They are Manchester and Cheshire, Birmingham, Leeds, Liverpool, Cambridge and London. And I suppose our reflections are that that infrastructure is absolutely critical to driving economic growth and scaling and commercialising scientific endeavour. It supports scientists and innovation at all stages, so from single innovators right up to multinational companies. The infrastructure acts as a magnet for talent and investment, supporting both national and local economies. The innovation research infrastructure across the UK is incredibly diverse and made up from investments from both the public and the private sectors. As a private sector organisation, I've spoken about where we have infrastructure. We've built and developed over 5 million square foot of laboratory and office space for science, tech and innovation sectors, and we're working to support over 1,100 science and tech businesses across those various UK locations in the cities and regions that I've mentioned. Those companies are startups, scale-ups and also global businesses that have chosen to put themselves in our cities in the North and the Midlands. We've got over 300 million of development kind of spade in the ground ongoing, so we're continuing to develop, and we're looking to bring another 1.5 million square foot of labs and infrastructure into those locations, and that will mean an uplift to supporting 2,600 businesses across by 2033, also in London as well. And I suppose some reflections are, as you would have heard about catapults in previous sessions, that infrastructure is spread out across the UK, but it's not evenly spread out. And I think that's obviously a challenge in terms of public sector investments, is that there isn't that, I suppose, evenness. We heard from Duncan earlier talking about the strength of research and the quantum of R&D coming out of Sheffield, Leeds and Manchester, but where the public sector is choosing to put its infrastructure investments isn't matching that concentration in our regional cities and locations. The UKRI have mapped out their infrastructure investments quite well, and they published that in their 2023 infrastructure roadmap. And that's a good resource for seeing the types of investments that have been made by the public sector, what they're working on, and the types of industrial sectors they're looking to support. But even in that report, there's very little on how you can unlock those public sector investments to grow regional economies. In that report, there's around 170 pages, and I think half a page is focused on regional economy and leveraging those innovation assets to support regional growth. So I think there's a lot more that can be done in terms of the placing of that public sector in innovation and those infrastructure assets, and thinking about more formally what are the regional KPIs, how they work with regional economies and regional businesses. It seems to be not happening by serendipity, but we accept there is a positive impact on a region, but actually what's the strategy and what are the KPIs that sit alongside those investments? And I think we could do more to map that out together. We know firsthand how important it is having public infrastructure in a cluster. Our site that Irene mentioned, Oldley Park, is home to the Medicines Discovery Catapult. UK Research and Innovation worked with Bruntwood to place that in 2016. And that's been absolutely fundamental in the early, I suppose, the creation, but also the start-up and scale-up phases of the Oldley Park cluster, having a piece of national infrastructure in Cheshire, where actually it's bringing world-class scientists into the site to collaborate, hosting of events. They really do draw businesses in, and I know that's something that's been spoken about previously and well documented through the work of Richard Jones.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Henri Murison.
So I'll carry on where we just left off with Richard Jones. So if you,
just introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Henri Murison. I'm the Chief Executive of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. And Richard and his co-author Tom Forth did a piece of work for Nesta called The Missing 4 Billion, which outlined the fact that actually in many regions of the UK, including particularly actually in parts of the northwest like Cheshire, the amount of public investment was vastly lower than the amount of private investment if you compared the comparable levels. Whereas there are some regions, particularly London, that over-index massively on public investment, but actually had less private sector investment. And Tom Forth particularly cites the example of Paul Nurse, who was obviously involved in the founding of the Crick, who said this could only be in London, was his argument about the Crick. And the challenge with that is if you look at the N8's response that they've given to this committee in their written evidence, they highlight very clearly that the disparities in health funding are largely to do with the Crick being in London. That's what's driven that. And if you then look at the major decisions made by the last government, when they decided to put ARIA somewhere, and ARIA, to be honest, is going to draw money out of the rest of the science budget, the evidence for ARIA necessarily going to work is not really there. Again, it's in London. So you've got a real challenge, which is that I want growth everywhere in the country. I don't want to have a zero-sum game. But it's policymakers and people within the science community who've made active decisions to put all the major national institutions largely in London, and that is problematic. Because it means that when we want to have a debate about regional growth, we're having to find extra money out of the science and innovation budget to do that, rather than having used some of those major national institutions to drive it. And so now there is going to be a choice between, do you spend money on ARIA or do you spend money on science and innovation in the regions, because government have made some poor choices. And I don't want to have that argument, right? I also chair something called the Growing Together Alliance. We've done work on connected clusters, which I'm sure we'll talk about. I want to be having positive conversations with other regions. And with my fellow business group and employee group leaders, we have very grown-up conversations about how we can work together. The people I don't think who have been behaving particularly well in the last 20 years have been people making major decisions about where to put big national institutions. And the interesting thing about Tom's most recent work is he charts how the leverage of extra money in London has brought with it more private funding. So now London is catching up in terms of its leverage because so much money has gone in, it's attracting more private money. And what that shows you is if you do put more public investment into science, but particularly into the sort of science that Patrick Vallant's chair was talking to you about when he gave evidence here, around that which leads more directly to growth, not just pure research, but applied research, if we were to spend a lot more of that money outside of London and parts of the southeast, you could have a big impact. And at the moment, unfortunately, we haven't had that impact because we haven't chosen to make those decisions. And I would reference really the kind of wider, which I'm sure we'll come on to, kind of infrastructure issues, which is that the fundamental argument is this is not about spreading jam. I'm not coming to you saying we should spend money everywhere because that would be fair. That's actually not my argument. My argument is if you go back to that evidence in the Nesta report, there was good evidence to spend money, particularly, for example, in the Northwest, and government ignored that evidence and chose to put those institutions somewhere else. And in a country where supposedly the Treasury is making decisions based on evidence, the argument I would make is never mind a fairness argument, there has been significant underinvestment against where the private sector has been choosing to put its money. And central government has essentially had a reverse regional policy. So never mind levelling up not having worked, we've never even tried an innovation. We've been doing the exact opposite. We've had a regional policy to advantage and preference London. And that is a very significant challenge to the science establishment, of which Patrick is a member, to really live up to the values of what he said to this committee, because bluntly he was part of the establishment that was doing the exact opposite when he was Chief Scientific Advisor. And those are difficult questions he has to answer. And I want to work with him on Oxford Cam, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later. And I want to work constructively with the Minister. But he's going to have to really show that he's a leopard who's changed his spots, because I'm afraid he is part of an establishment in the science and funding community. And when people like George Osborne set up institutions headquartered in Manchester, like the Royce Institute, many people in the science funding community went completely berserk because he was breaking their orthodoxy of where they put investments. But the Royce Institute had a base in Imperial, had a base in Cambridge, for example. These were not anti-Golden Triangle interventions, but the community of people who make these decisions normally was so angry about it because it went against their orthodoxy that you couldn't possibly headquarter something like the Royce in Manchester, because whenever they'd made decisions rather than a chancellor doing it, they'd made decisions which bluntly were against the interests of the rest of the UK.
And you've set the committee a number of provocative points and questions. And before I hand over to Emily, just let me come back to you on two particular points. Now, with regard to the Minister Vallance, he did say to this committee that curiosity-driven research will happen where it will happen, sort of implying that government had no influence over pure research. But you are, if I get right, making the point that the placing of infrastructure, science infrastructure, does drive investment in pure or curiosity-driven research as well as in applied research. Is that right?
I think it does, yes. And I think Patrick was making a complete divide between pure science research and what he would consider to be growth or applied research. And I think the challenge is in those areas where there is a very clear link between pure research and potential applied opportunities. Yes. That argument doesn't hold up to much scrutiny. So what I'm not saying is we should shut down Oxford and Cambridge and move them. What I'm alluding to is there are 8 research-intensive universities in the north of England. And I would argue that when you look at where you've chosen to put your investments, you are making decisions by the way in which things have been done in the past. And the challenge, I think, and those like Nancy Rothwell, who was the former sort of President and Vice Chancellor at Manchester, now on the Industrial Strategy Council, Nancy's made similar arguments, maybe in a more polite and erudite way than I would ever do. But I don't think I'm alone in having some concerns about some of the previous ways in which big decisions were made.
And with regard to those previous decisions, is there anything that could be done now? You mentioned the crick and area in order to move more of the investment outside of London, for example, hubs and spokes, or smaller pilots, or etc. Is there anything that could be done to retrospectively change the impact of those decisions?
I think there has been good evidence of that being attempted. So the University of Manchester, and obviously you had evidence from Professor Caldwell previously, under Dame Nancy's leadership, did work very constructively with Camden. Manchester City Council have got a very strong relationship with Camden. And that relationship actually predates the relationship between Manchester and Cambridge that I think almost came up in the last session, but you never quite got to talk about. And those types of bilateral relationships are really positive. They are referenced prominently in the Connected Clusters piece of work that I and my colleagues at that coalition of organisations published recently. So there are good examples of doing that, but it doesn't change the kind of original starting points, which is that central government, and in particular their agencies in the research funding world, have made purposeful decisions to do things that have had very significant implications for regional growth. And their inability to accept they've done that and accept the consequences of that, when they then, for example, have a strength in places competition that is literally setting areas to compete against each other for peanuts, and a process which I had from a previous science minister who is no longer in this place, who may no longer be a Conservative, but he said to me that he had to intervene because the West Midlands wasn't going to win, and so a better bid in Greater Manchester for strength in places didn't get funded. And so all of these sort of very cack-handed bits of very low amounts of money being competed on in a Hunger Games style, when the big decisions had all been made and put things elsewhere, is a pretty shoddy record for the last government. And I'm afraid they do have to accept the consequences that they have left us with a very significant number of structural problems in how our economy is going to work, because innovation and research is driving productivity enhancement. And if it is in certain parts of the country and not in others, and I happen to be in a part of the country where productivity is rising, particularly in Greater Manchester, relative to the national trend, but it would have risen more quickly if we hadn't made these decisions in such a purposeful way to try and create an outcome which was the reverse. So these decisions were trying to keep down productivity in Greater Manchester, in essence, because they were choosing to put the money somewhere else, and it didn't work. But if they'd been going with the grain of economic growth and had been backing places with high growth productivity, we could have seen those productivity increases happen much more quickly.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'm not going to revisit the Crick case, but just to remind you that it was actually about a replacement for Mill Hill, which was already based in London, and having been involved in that building of the case and getting it funded by the Treasury. There's a lot more to it than what you're describing.
I would argue that I'm not the only person who takes the view of this, which is that Paul's public remarks belie a very significant underlying view in many people's minds.
Paul wasn't even involved at the beginning, right? So he wasn't even. I don't even think he was back in the UK at the point that it was first conceived. So, right. So let's talk about how government should be making decisions around science infrastructure. So should it be making decisions on the basis of there's low economic growth and low wages in an area, so we should put something there to kickstart something? Should it be looking at available current small and emerging clusters, potentially around research-intensive universities, which would leave big gaps across the country if it would just focus, let's say, on Russell Group and didn't extend to some of the innovation-focused universities and spin-out universities? Or should it be looking at building that infrastructure on areas of success already? Where should, if we're going to have, not on any specific project, and let's not revisit any specific project decisions, going forward, we have a government that's talked about enhancing science infrastructure, not least AI infrastructure. What should be its priorities? Saying, we'll put it where there's little to no growth. We'll put it where there is already an existing cluster around a research-intensive university, thereby leaving deserts. Yeah. Yeah. Or should it build and put it where there's already very strong clusters in that area to maximise and get earlier returns?
Okay. We'll start with Kath.
Thank you, sorry, Chair. That's a great question, and I mean, I'd agree with some of Henri's comments previously around it's not a case of every region waiting their turn. There is excellence across the whole of the UK. In many of our research-intensive universities, they will be, there'll be research projects and translational research that is world-leading. So I think first of all, it's just to ensure that there is the mapping and gapping across the UK of where we are globally and nationally excellent, and I think it is to build on that excellence across our UK cities and regions. There are issues with that, as you've pointed out. I think potentially there will be gaps, but then I'm sure we'll have a conversation at some point this morning about transport and actually how do we increase the talent pool to get people moving across regions and pan regions to get into those clusters. I think that if we start, I suppose, building on areas where there are very few assets, lack of talent, I think that may take us to a difficult place. That there are plenty of emerging clusters across our cities and regions where they will benefit from further investment.
And I just challenge that research-intensive. Well, research-intensive institutions we tend to talk about as Russell Group institutions. But when you look at the innovation, the old red brick, in terms of their impact on innovation, spin-outs, actually some of them have a much better success record than the research-intensive. So do you think we're cutting off opportunities if we're not looking at also those old red bricks are very much those innovation-focused universities as clusters as well?
I think that I didn't mean Russell Group. I mean, there are plenty of universities across the North and the Midlands who aren't Russell Group traditional universities. So that's not my interpretation.
And Steve would tell you the South West has some great institutions.
We're not in the South West, but I'm sure.
UE at Bristol is fantastic, but often not considered within that. We've got institutions, we've got Coventry, and what goes on there. Again, not necessarily listed under research intensive. So I guess what I'm really trying to get to is when I absolutely take your point about breaking the biases, but actually do we need to challenge some of the biases that we come to with this research intensive as well, and not just the geographic biases that we currently have?
I mean, we're working with Aston University in the Midlands, where we've developed a cluster working on digital and tech around their geography and work closely with them. So there are many examples of relationships that we've got that are outside of traditional Russell Group.
I would say that your question is very well posed, but I would give you the starting from the other end of the spectrum. So in the north of England, we have a very clear purpose to doing this work and why we're interested in it, which is that part of raising northern productivity to get an extra 1 million jobs by 2050 to significantly close the economic divide with the UK average requires our economy to become more innovative. But actually the vast majority of the benefits are applied to sectors that are not traditionally innovative sectors. So it's the end product of the innovation. So I would start from the other end of the telescope. So we've done some work with the business school at Durham, which we'll be publishing in the next few months, which we'll obviously send to the committee. But the basic schematic of that is if you look at technology skills, the absorptive capacity in regions and the structure, so that is transport infrastructure, but also digital infrastructure, you can work out the ability of all the businesses that have the potential to be more productive to adopt. Many things are just diffusion things, which might have already been come up with. And that's where you start from. And that is largely in many parts of the country where there are few research institutions or translation institutions where you need to have an impact, and you need to find models like, for example, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point, the Made Smarter pilots, which were first in the Northwest but now are across the country. Those are designed around the businesses that benefit, not who provides them. Does that make sense? They're provided by different people in different regions. So I would start from that starting point of we want to raise productivity in the rest of the economy, and that'd be my one challenge to you as a committee in how you frame this inquiry. Is you talk about spin-ups and scale-ups a lot. I'm largely interested in how we apply innovation to the rest of the economy, because that's where most of the benefits are, and a lot of that is stuff that is nothing to do with Russell Group universities, so that makes sense. I was just making a point about we currently spend so much of our money on pure science. We subsidise science for the whole world. We spend so little on the stuff that I'm really interested in. That obviously, I point to the examples of the stuff that we spend everything on, but actually I think we should spend a lot more of the money. And if you look at the innovation deal that Greater Manchester have got, I'm not an expert on the one in the West Midlands, but I know Kath knows more about it. They are not spending money entirely on just extending pure research projects and turning them into businesses. Does that make sense? They're doing lots of stuff, for example, in the case of Greater Manchester, to apply AI in the economy. And they've got a project they've got a business on one of their programmes that I think is a timber merchants, and they're applying AI to a timber merchants. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about making the rest of the economy more productive.
But Henri, I think you were talking about a process, and you said you would start with the end result, what you wanted to improve productivity, and then what was the rest of the process, and then you'd go.
So then you work out what institutions and interventions you need to achieve that goal, rather than saying, we've got a science budget, how do we prioritise that 20-odd billion? Does that make sense? How do we spend it? My starting point is work out what you need to make the economy more productive by 2050, and then work out from the public and private sector how you find that money and who should spend it, rather than assume you're going to spend any of it on the things you do now. Because the argument I would make is that the UK has spent a lot of money on science for a long time, and we have one of the most unproductive economies in the Western world. So clearly we're not doing something right. And I would argue that we're doing many things well, but the bit we're missing is applying the types of changes which would raise productivity often to SMEs and businesses that themselves do not think of themselves as innovative. How you apply innovation and innovations to businesses which do not consider themselves to be innovative is where most of the productivity benefit of the work of this committee comes. Right. But the reality is the producer interest is all at the high end, and the stuff that is whiz-bang and exciting. This is stuff that's relatively probably dull. Does that make sense to the innovation community? But it's very important in economic terms.
I don't disagree with you on translational research being a really important part, but it would require significant change about where money goes in our university sector to support those institutions that have strengths in translational research. I did want to kind of get back to, I'll come back to you, Dr. Mackay. So, you know, you have a real commitment to the West Midlands, to the Midlands, yet you're expanding into London. So what I'm just trying to understand is, what is the decision that your decision making, back to my original kind of, do you invest where there isn't anything? Do you invest where there's a bit of something? It will take a while, but it will, or do you invest to get a greater return quickly because there already is quite a lot going on there? So I appreciate it's a similar decision tree, I would guess, than that the government has when it's deciding where its science infrastructure should be. So do you want to talk us around the thinking of Bruntwood SciTech? That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Let me
take moving some of its focus and investments into London.
And as part of that, we have Manchester Pension Fund investing in London, which just seems to be reverse. Financial flows.
There might be really good reasons.
Let me walk you through some of that. Yeah, no, absolutely. So yes, so our shareholders are in our science business are Bruntwood, the property company, Legal and General, and Greater Manchester Pension Fund. Greater Manchester Pension Fund, we've worked with very closely in Manchester, but has invested in the UK business. So you're absolutely right that they're part of our decision making around London. And the decision in question, for those that aren't aware, we made the announcement at the end of last year that we were forming a new partnership with Imperial College, and we're going to be creating a £200 million innovation hub in their White City deep tech cluster, which is already an established deep tech cluster full of spin-outs and scaling businesses in West London. And the decision making for us as a business is that our model is predominantly around partnering with local authorities, universities and hospital trusts. So we're deeply embedded and also have equity joint ventures and joint projects with those public sector institutions. And while there have been discussions around London, and I suppose districts are very interested in what we've done in the North and the Midlands, it didn't fit the model. And when we knew Imperial were looking, it was attractive to us because I don't need to explain who they are and what they do, but actually we found a like-minded partner that was interested in growing the innovation economy through working with us as an investor developer and growing facilities. So I suppose for us it was, if we were going to go into London at all, it had to be the right partnership with the public sector, and we found that through Imperial. The broader decision making is that we've been in the North and the Midlands for many years, spending a lot of time and investment into creating the right facilities that grow regional economies in those northern cities and Birmingham. And we felt the time was right to take that model into London. We think there's a huge opportunity to create a network and I suppose a backbone of innovation in linking those clusters across the UK, where we've got academic institutes, hospital trusts and businesses of all size and shape in those locations. So I think from our point of view, we think there's an opportunity for those businesses in our sites already to gain access to some of the expertise in London. And I suppose picking on our the previous discussion you heard, that's VC and finance and the concentration of finance that's currently in the capital. Potentially there are opportunities for those businesses in our northern and Midlands clusters, dipping into talent in the capital. But there's also, I think it genuinely works the other way. I mean, when we were selected by Imperial, it was because of our track record across the UK and what we'd done in those northern and Midlands locations. The ability to work with our partners in those locations was attractive. And for businesses that come into that development in White City, we will be able to leverage those partnerships with the public sector bodies and institutes in the north and open up that pool of 1,000 businesses. So I'm sure we're going to get to transport at some point and actually do that connectivity.
So
but for us,
let's move on. We need to move.
Final question. I've got... Oh, no, that's Martin. So we change it. Let's move that to Martin. Martin, you asked.
No, I think it's Adam.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I've got to shoot off to another event in a minute or two, so I'll just ask one question. Regarding the way that you are interacting with local government, I mean, what kind of role do you think local government plays in improving science and innovation infrastructure, and how are you both interacting directly with local government?
We're working closely with government. We've got deep relationships in all the regions in which we operate. That's our model. We've got some equity partnerships with local government. Cheshire East are a shareholder in Alderley Park. Manchester Science Park in Manchester, shareholder is Manchester City Council. So we've worked together on schemes where it's beneficial for the local economy and the local business base. We've worked to discuss where there are challenges in some of the regional locations on viability. And what I mean by that simply is that building laboratories and scientific infrastructure is a high-cost endeavour. It's even more difficult over the last couple of years as the cost of borrowing has increased and the cost of goods has increased. And in some regional locations, I suppose SMEs in particular and scale-ups in particular aren't able to kind of bear the cost of that development. So it presents a viability gap in some of those locations where actually it's quite difficult to get projects off the ground. So in those instances, local authorities have been open to subsidy and grants. So that's one area where they've been able to facilitate a development in a new geography or an immature cluster through subsidy. We've also worked with local authorities as well on enterprise zones previously, so the local enterprise partnerships where we've been able to make clusters more attractive by offering business rate relief in particular geographies, and that's been really, I suppose, fundamental in establishing our life science clusters in Alderley Park and Manchester, where a number of businesses have come into those locations. I think 24 in the Manchester cluster and 28 in Alderley Park, where they've been able to be incentivised to come in through that support.
Thanks for that, Kath. Being a little self-reflective, you've got a lot of relationships with local government. How do you think you could improve that to boost the regions?
I think where, I suppose, we can work with them more closely, I suppose, to translate where there are strengths in our clusters. So I suppose it's kind of educating them where they don't have the capability to understand what they've got in their geography and what's truly world leading. I think we can support our local authorities better and work, well, we continue to work closely with them where they can actually start to make more decisions around innovation and innovation funding. Great. So, I mean, we've seen through innovation accelerator, which Henri's mentioned, it's only a pilot and it's a very small amount of money, salami sliced over various different regions. But actually, there is the ability to build that capability and that capacity into our local authorities where they can start to be more autonomous over their decision making around infrastructure, R&D and innovation.
Thank you, Kath. And Henri, anything to add on that?
Yeah, so my background prior to this role, and when I first met the chair, so I'll disclose that, was when I was in local government, and we had to deal with the then Cities Minister, Greg Clark, whatever happened to him, to do business rates retention. It was a very generous deal, actually, to be honest, particularly. So I was very grateful still, and I'm still grateful to Greg for it. And that allowed the City Council to redevelop what was then called Science Central, is now referred to as the Helix, which is essentially kind of expanded the city centre of Newcastle and has included lots of the innovation facilities, both those of the university, but also that L&G have developed on the back of that investment. And so I think you can see a more positive role for local government where they're funded to do so. The same I would say about the Greater Manchester innovation approach and the one that's being taken in the West Midlands and in Glasgow. And the argument I think we're having really is about, for me, local government currently has very little role in the allocation of innovation funding. And combined authorities are starting to get a small influence. But if you were going to move, for example, to more translational spending, if that was where you're going to grow expenditure, not stop funding science, I'm not heathen, but if we were still going to do what the last government was going to do and increase the overall proportion of GDP, I don't really believe that the economy's become as in GDP terms as innovation intensive as it has done, because obviously we introduced some more tax credits and suddenly more people started doing R&D. I'm not sure all of that was necessarily behaviour change. Some of that was probably people claiming stuff that maybe isn't as much R&D, particularly in some SMEs. So if the government was going to keep to the spirit of the previous GDP target and grow the pie, that you wouldn't put that into the traditional funding system. You would give that to combined authorities and local government to spend it on things that would have the most impact on productivity. And that isn't about, and there is clearly a relationship, right, between your ability to apply AI in a particular economy and the research happening in a field like AI, but it doesn't have to be done in the same place. That's the joy. So I'm not, that there is excellence in this country and around the world that could be applied in local areas, many of whom don't have research-intensive universities at all, or even universities in some cases at all. And so some of the models of partnership have also got around some of those locational issues. So in the Northeast universities did the Northern Accelerator programme together. That included Teesside, and I think now includes York. So you are getting the same as you heard from Duncan about the clustering happening around funding and financing, getting to the right level of scale. I think universities themselves are starting to collaborate at the right level to deliver interventions that have genuine impact. And that's about getting away from a university lens on innovation, I would argue, and looking at it from the perspective, and I work for a business organisation, of the employer and of the people who are doing the actual activity in the economy, and structuring the system around their needs rather than the producer interest, right? So this is about a change in how we orientate ourselves rather than just spending more money ad infinitum, because we can't do that. We have to target it on the things that have the biggest impact.
Well, I think, thank you, Adam, thank you. I think Martin now has a question regarding exactly public and private financing.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I'm sort of listening to what's been said already and sort of reconsidering the questions that I have in front of me. Intriguing to hear your discussion of Hunger Games, having come from 10 years in local government before this role, very much something we recognise. There's a lot of, I guess, coming back to that sort of local government sort of thing, I'm still struggling to see how we mix the sort of the public and the private investment in places. My constituency is virtually next door to Steve's, and we look to Exeter University. We have an awful lot of smaller businesses, a few very high-tech businesses, and some interesting ones hidden away that need actually some thought as to how they might expand and scale up and move forward. I went to see a 50-year-old manufacturing industry that does hydraulics, high-precision hydraulics. They do maritime control systems that they sell through global positioning. So you plug this lovely little device to into your system, and it will steer you around the world on your multi-million-dollar yacht that's just sailing around the world. Absolutely brilliant. Tucked away in the back, behind a whole load of other things. How do we get them to do more and actually expand more and use some of the things that might be coming out of Exeter University? So I'm thinking about sort of, it's almost spill out from the science parks that we have, from those sorts of innovation places. How do we use public and private sort of money to actually do that, to spread beyond the little clusters that are building, the larger clusters that are building, to move out of the triangles, even if it's just into the hinterlands of those places, which is a slightly different question to what I had written, sorry.
I mean, it's sort of, I appreciate the question because it's kind of where I'm trying to get to, which is that whether it's large businesses, so Siemens have put a train factory up in Goole, making tube trains for Sadiq, which is very nice of Sadiq to give us that order, and that's employing hundreds of people, right, in manufacturing jobs. But when Siemens came to Goole, they also wanted to bring their R&D activity and their supply chain all to be there as well. And so that is an example of sometimes you make an investment decision in that case because it's near motorways and you can get the talent, right? And then that means that would then be a good place to do that innovation activity. Well, but it's linked to the real economy rather than being because it's the natural place for the innovators to go. Does that make sense? So I think some of this is push and pull. And I suppose that's what I'm getting at, is I absolutely think there are some inherent logics to where scale-ups and in particular spin-outs from universities are going to go. We need to support those businesses. Absolutely we do. But I think in your work, I'm coming here not to be a contrarian, but just to kind of make the point that as well as focusing in detail on those issues which are specifically of interest to your committee, you do need to consider the rest of the economy. That makes sense. Because the rest of the economy that is not in those categories is why the UK has such poor productivity performance. So we do have lots of successful businesses in this country. Maybe we don't keep enough of them. Maybe we don't grow them quite as much as we could. All those things are true, but we also have a load of other businesses who are significantly behind where they should be. And there are models that have been used, right? So the AMRC, following the Science Innovation Audit that looked at high-value manufacturing in Sheffield and in South Yorkshire, and in Lancashire, most of the SIAs got put in a cupboard and never used. This one did get used. It was one of the first ones. The AMRC decided to put a physical presence in Lancashire. And why you can't just get from Lancashire to Sheffield to use the original AMRC, we will come back to later. But fundamentally, they had to put this presence there because otherwise they couldn't reach the businesses. And they've had some phenomenal results, largely using what was at the time European funding that was designed to deal with regional disparities. Lancashire had one of the biggest allocations of EU money. It still gets a lot of money from the Shared Prosperity Fund, but now it's spread up between every district council in Lancashire and 2 unitaries. So it's not used quite as effectively, sadly, as it used to be, which is another thing we're doing some research on at the moment. And what the AMRC was able to do was to influence and impact on hundreds of businesses, the same as they've done in South Yorkshire. So as well as in South Yorkshire dealing with Boeing, dealing with lots of other big names, with Rolls-Royce and Rolls-Royce SMR, for example, in Lancashire they are specifically focused on SMEs in Lancashire. And yes, there are lots of OEMs in Lancashire. There is BAE, there are others, but they have lots of supply chain businesses who also need the same machining, the same tooling that the prime businesses need. And I think in how you design these models, what you are largely seeking to do is not come up with new innovation. It's about applying things that are already known in existing businesses. And that's why Jürgen, when he did the Made Smarter review, Jürgen Meyer, who now runs GB Energy, but was at the time at Siemens, was so passionate, and he was our vice chair for a while, about applying technology to businesses, because his view was that Siemens and businesses like it would do very well out of the fourth industrial revolution, thank you very much. But if you were trying to apply digitalisation in manufacturing to SMEs, they would need extra help. And I think at the last hearing, Kit Morehouse got very annoyed about the digital catapult. I think if you look at Made Smarter, there are some good examples of central government money being used to help SMEs to adopt technology change, which otherwise they would not have done. And when we managed to not do the last industrial revolution, we do need to really get better at this. We do need to get better. Sorry, Chief.
We've only got a couple of minutes left. Fisher, I think we can go on for some time longer, but we do need to come to other aspects of infrastructure as well. And I think Kath,
I was just going to come on that point really and say I think that we need to think about how do we work together across the public and private sector on pan-regional innovation. And you would have heard from Lou Corbett in the last session around the Cambridge-Manchester partnership, where actually there are huge areas of complementarity across two very different geographies. I think that's something that we need to consider. When we work with businesses across our sites, many of those are global businesses. They're not thinking about, do I locate in Manchester or do I locate in Liverpool? They're thinking about, do I locate in Manchester or do I locate in Barcelona or Brussels? So I think there is something around how do we join up the regions and the clusters and ensure that we're able to talk to each other from a regional perspective. I'm involved with an organisation called the Northern Health Science Alliance, and that brings together the research-intensive universities and the hospital trusts that are conducting research in the north. And they run many kind of pan-regional projects to deploy and test novel diagnostics using the whole of the north as a test bed, the same for advanced therapies and so on and so on. And that's an organisation that was previously publicly funded from UKRI, now it's a membership model, but actually it's pulling together the centres of excellence across what is quite a large geography to get the most for patients in the UK.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to move on to transport now. Thanks very much, Martin. Alison.
There's two aspects actually to wider complementary infrastructure and transport. So with regards to complementary infrastructure, I'm talking about things like transport, utilities, housing, digital connectivity as well. And I think in reading this sort of brief, I'm feeling a chicken and egg situation where to attract that innovation and that investment inwards and help develop it from there, you need that infrastructure. To get that infrastructure, you sort of need the investment. So it's how this works. And before I sort of ask my questions, I just want to bring your mind to my constituency, Stoke-on-Trent South. I'm not just plugging my own. There's a reason why I want to talk about it. Stoke-on-Trent is the 13th biggest city in the country. It exists within the wider North Staffordshire. We have two universities. Oh, point of notice, I'm a honorary research fellow at Keele University, which is one of them, so that I must let that know. So two universities. We're at the 5,500 hub of the growth corridor, the advanced manufacturing growth corridor, all the way through to Derby universities, Nottingham universities, which ends actually at the end of Megawatt Valley, which I learned about recently, which is fantastic. So we've got this North Midlands growth corridor, and Stoke-on-Trent City has a huge economic latency, but we're stuck between Birmingham and Manchester and the investment there. So my question really links to about, how could, a city like Stoke-on-Trent South and these other regions that have been mentioned, what's how can we attract that infrastructure, and what's the gaps, investment, and what the gaps are in terms of what we can offer in terms of that complementary infrastructure. So the question is, how do gaps in supporting infrastructure such as transport, housing or digital connectivity impact regional innovation? And I'll go to you first, Kath.
Thank you. I mean, they do impact, and we know when we're dealing with companies that want to move into one of our clusters, they'll be looking at space in the first instance, but quite quickly the conversation turns to recruitment. Where am I going to employ people? Where do they come from? Where do they live? So you'll know yourself, it's incredibly important. And global companies are making these big decisions around our regions where not only are we promoting an innovation cluster, we've really got to work together across the private sector and the public sector to promote a whole region, because the conversation does shift to people in, people out, quite quickly, and housing and schools and healthcare. So I would say it's incredibly important. And I think, in my experience, I suppose one of the biggest challenges actually is that pan-regional transport across larger geographies. I suppose the senior talent pool in many of our R&D, our tech and life science companies is not only national, it's global. So we'll have people coming from the south up to our sites in the Midlands and the north, and vice versa, actually. The senior people, they're distributed across the UK and Europe, so they're coming into our sites from far afield. So it's something that we have got to work on to get the right kind of senior C-suite talent into our global businesses. Henri, do you want to say anything? You're not going to say on that than me.
I know you have a lot of experience with trains.
All I would say is, for the work I mentioned earlier, we did as part of the Growing Together Alliance, we spoke to businesses, a number of clusters and corridors, and we talked to Unilever, for example, who have a big presence at Port Sunlight. They also have lots of R&D in West Yorkshire linked to their manufacturing facilities. They were very concerned about how difficult it was to move between those places, even though they're very close together. So there was a reason why in our work on this, we talked about the fact that both within kind of mega regions, but between regions, you also need better transport links. And those would obviously help innovation-intensive businesses that are seeking to attract and retain talent. So if you're trying to get good research people, and it's a similar argument about the Oxford-Cambridge corridor arc, that you do need to invest in that infrastructure, but it's probably for two different reasons in innovation terms. So there are some parts of the UK that could be significantly more innovative in terms of the types of innovation activity and innovation-intensive businesses they attract. The north of England will be one of those places, and we're constrained by the fact that our cities are relatively small, they're not well connected, and so the agglomerative kind of opportunity of giving the scale of our operation from Newcastle through to Liverpool is constrained. The challenge in Oxford and Cambridge is different, which is that those are very successful economies that are trying to attract talent to research in particular, and those people cannot afford to live there because housing is constrained because of infrastructure being constrained, water, transport, etc. So they are the same, often they come with the same barriers, but sometimes what you're trying to do is attract innovative businesses to an area, and sometimes you're trying to deal with the consequences of having been very successful at doing that. And you often have to invest in the same things, but it is a different reason for doing it. And bluntly, the Green Book, which is currently being reviewed by the Chancellor and her team, incentivises you to spend money on things that are already happening and dealing with the consequences of growth rather than trying to stimulate growth. So, and this applies to other regions of the UK as well that would consider themselves peripheral, that if you're trying to attract investment based on improving something so people will come, it's very hard to get that funded. And I think there's an argument we should do both, right? So I'm not the person saying here today we should stop doing anything, we shouldn't move the crick or stop doing the crick, right? The point is that it's evidence of, if you make purposeful decisions, whether it's about supporting infrastructure or whether it's about actual direct science-related infrastructure, you get results. And we've obviously been behind the private sector-led consortium looking to improve connectivity between Birmingham and Manchester. That explicitly includes better connectivity for Stoke, because Stoke's connectivity to Manchester is another one of its strong economic drivers because of its proximity. So we're very aware that wider infrastructure debate can have a big impact on the innovation economy, because these people who are knowledge-intensive workers will often want to commute to big cities. But then I know from talking to your colleague in central Stoke constituency, there's a lot of startups that have come out of people who maybe worked in other places but live in Stoke and have then chosen to start businesses in Stoke. So your ability to live in Stoke and work somewhere that might have a larger cluster in a particular industry is a big driver of whether you'll start a business in Stoke. Does that make sense? Because you won't have had that job or been able to live in Stoke if the connectivity is not right. So I think there's a number of questions to unpack, but I'm conscious of time, Chair. I've gone on too much.
And actually, you have touched on a couple of my further questions, which is...
Trying to cover as much ground as quickly as possible.
I appreciate it.
And galloping through the agenda.
I mean, it is. You've got this, you need the infrastructure in place to attract the innovation and growth, and then you get the innovation and growth, and now you've got additional pressures as a result of that, and how we deal with that. So just very short answer, and I want to come back to transport if the time has gone, because you've mentioned one thing that triggered me. What are the most, in answering that chicken and egg situation, what is the most pressing issue with supporting infrastructure in areas where you operate, and what would be relevant to an area like Stoke-on-Trent to learn from?
Do you want to go first?
You go first.
So I think I talking about the NHS, I remember their original chief exec, Hakim, who's gone back into the industry now, saying to me that you couldn't get talent, for example, in the life sciences, because people might live in the next city, but they couldn't build a career in the north of England because they wouldn't know that if that startup fails, they wouldn't be able to get a job in the next place because they couldn't easily commute and still get back for pickup from nursery, right? It's just people's everyday life problems, right? And that would be my point, that you can look at the UK as a relatively small country and think, oh, why is that place not more productive? Well, because we're really poorly connected in transport terms outside London and the South East, and that leads to some pretty negative consequences. And if you get to the kind of business I was talking about earlier, who I would want to be absorbing and thinking about using innovation in their day-to-day business, the inability, if you're in many regions of the north, because the roads are full because there's no good train lines, to get products to and from market is going to stop you from using innovation, because if you are not able to compete for business because you can't be in a just-in-time supply chain, you're not going to apply that innovation to your business. Does that make sense? Yeah. So there is an element of that. All this stuff starts to interact, which is that businesses' willingness to invest in plant and equipment is driven by their connectivity, because it affects their ability to interact with the market. So all these decisions, they affect each other. Does that make sense?
So to Dr. Mackay, and then I just want to come back to a comment on transport. Yes.
Yeah, I mean we need, there are well documented skills gaps in various different science and tech disciplines, and I can think of the rate of growth for some of our companies, some of our clusters. They're looking to kind of double in size over the next kind of 5 years. So I suppose I'm rushing through my answer, but in layman's terms, transport will allow more people onto those sites and into those companies. If we get it right, it's a great equaliser. It's opening up huge opportunities in science and tech companies from people, in outside of the cluster to come in. And they aren't just, I suppose, elite professor or scientist roles where they've got hundreds of patents under their belt. These can be people who are school leavers, exiting kind of further education colleges with technical skills who can come into these clusters and provide real value into our scientific companies. But we need to get the transport right.
So transport has come out as the major issue, I think, over sort of national grid, water, housing, but those are really relevant. So I'll come back to transport. And I will mention, Henri, that you mentioned the Birmingham to Manchester connectivity and how potentially it would benefit Stoke. The current proposals that have been put forward don't, because we're on a
I'll answer that point.
main line. So that really does. If when you've got an area sort of that economic latency, that has to be considered. But you link to this idea of this east-west connectivity as well. I think we tend to look very north-south along those big arteries, but a lot of the examples you've given is about this east-west link, being able to travel across regions in that way. And I mentioned the North Midlands and there. So with regards to that, how can improved transport links between cities, such as Stoke, Derby, Nottingham, rather than that way, drive regional investment and innovation-led growth? And what transport policy specifically would unlock that investment?
I'll happily come and see you about the Stoke thing, and I'll write to the committee as well, because there is a point about displaced capacity, that wherever you put the new line, if you've got more capacity, you get more direct services, including HS2 once to Stoke. But I'll pick that up separately, Chair, because I realise that is a cul-de-sac that you will rightly scold me for. And the simple answer is that the connected clusters work we did directly identified that those east-west links are particularly important. We highlighted the links between Oxford, Milton Keynes and Cambridge in particular, and the ones between the northern cities, because those ones, there's particular evidence of the scale of those cities and the fact that the growth potential of being constrained by their travel to work areas being too small. And I think the obvious point is that knowledge intensive businesses need to usually in well connected places, because they need to attract relatively large numbers of those people into one place. And there is the point is there is only one economy in this country that currently has a transport system that allows you to get large numbers of people to one place, and it's London. And the way they deal with this in America is they don't necessarily build train lines, they just build lots of motorways in their cities. And the thing about the UK, and they're actually now doing public transport as well, is that in Europe they build mass transit systems, in America they build motorways. In this country we've basically done neither, apart from in London and the South East. And that is problematic. And that is why you look at the productivity of many cities in the UK and compare them to their European equivalents, and they are dramatically lower. And so I think innovation policy can solve some of those problems, but the whole point about, and Jim O'Neill's original thesis about the kind of Northern Powerhouse idea was about the principle that you do all these things together. So there's a reason that Jim chairs Gritstone and is also interested in this transport stuff, is that doing one of these things in isolation will have a certain benefit. But if UK government, as it is doing with the Oxford-Cambridge Arc, and I welcome that, taking an integrated approach across housing, transport, innovation policy, you'll get much better results. And the point that I think I and other business groups would make is it's the point about having an integrated plan in which innovation is part of it is the right solution, because the example of having overheated the Oxford and Cambridge economy by having rightly invested in world-class research that has led to lots of business and economic success, but not having put in place the infrastructure to cope with that is absolutely bananas. And it's the same problem, but a different way round, to have the north of England where you've got all this latent potential and you've not invested to unlock it. They're both big problems for the UK. We need to solve them both.
Let's hear from...
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've spoken a lot about the Oxcam arc in this session. It's obviously captured the public imagination as well, and certainly supportive of providing those transport and infrastructure links to join up those huge and internationally significant innovation clusters. I suppose I would make the point that that could be applied across other high growth clusters which are already well established in the UK. What can we be doing to provide connectivity across the HS2 line from Old Oak Common, where Imperial are developing a campus, right the way through up to the Knowledge Quarter in Birmingham. If I think of the major kind of life science and tech clusters in Manchester, Cheshire, Liverpool, huge east to west issues with connectivity, and actually they are rapidly growing clusters, and they need significant support over the long term and a long-term strategy to bring them together in what is actually relatively small geography. We think in terms of these small cities and these small regions, but the geography in question is incredibly small.
That's really good. And one final, very quick closing comment. I think that draws out something that you referred to about keeping people and attracting the talent. Innovation and startups have a tendency to fail, and Lord Vallance mentioned this about accepting that level of failure, but providing the infrastructures that talent can stay within the region with the life in the houses and the nurseries, but be able to travel easily to where the other jobs are. So I think that was a good point.
When people go to a location, they're not just moving for a job, they're thinking about the next 3 jobs, they're thinking about where their partner works, they're thinking, is this a big enough opportunity to take my children out of school and move to a new region? So it's not just kind of selling a business, it's working to get together to sell a whole cluster.
I think that's a theme. Thank you very much. I think that is a theme which has come out in all our sort of discussions, is that the interconnected nature of the sort of regional economic growth challenges and also branding. And one of the messages I'm taking away from this discussion is that our regions need to have better branding and a better, easier opportunity to both attract investment and to drive and deliver infrastructure. But we've run out of time. I think we could have carried on for a lot longer. Can I just thank, on behalf of the committee, thank both of you, Kath Mackay and Henri Murison, because you have fueled a very lively discussion, raised possibly more questions than we've answered, but we will look forward to integrating your comments in our report. And thank you very much for making the time to spend with us.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.